Hi, I'm Tim. Join me in this video as I discuss a remote ID module available today for $39. A standalone remote ID module for $39 that weighs 10 grams. Let's get to it. For an overview of this video, we're going to focus on the cost of RC flying, and I'd like to highlight a remote ID module that I found for $39 that's ready to go. As part of this discussion, I'm going to talk about a cost of the history of RC. I'll give some examples of how the cost of our electronics have gone down through the understanding of inflation, and this will be very applicable to the development of remote ID modules for our modelers. A lot of the comments I get on these videos, people are concerned about the cost of a remote ID module. The cost today is very high, but is coming down. Also, I have a lot of videos you can see in the description on the concept of remote ID. As part of this video, I'll give a very short overview of the remote ID so you understand what that is and the importance of the remote ID modules to comply with remote ID. Finally, I'm going to give some editorial discussion on the concept of remote ID. I get a lot of comments on people that saying you shouldn't have remote ID, it's wrong, the FAA can't do this. And I wish to give you my understanding with documentation that remote ID is here to stay. I repeat, remote ID is here to stay, and it will suit all of us if we could learn to understand that and live with that concept. As always, thank you for your likes and subscribes to the video. They truly help the algorithm, allow me to produce more videos. Also, if you'd like to jump ahead to different sections of the video, just hover your mouse or pointer over the timeline. I've divided this discussion into chapters, and you can go to any chapter you want in that way. Let's talk for a moment about the cost of RC flying. I've always felt that RC flying today, that's being filmed in June of 2023, is the most affordable it's ever been. And we need to discuss a little bit about inflation and what happens to the cost of electronics. Inflation is a fact of life in any industrialized country, to include America. Keep in mind that for a normal economy in any industrialized nation, an inflation rate of about 1.5% to 2% is considered perfectly normal. It's what is needed to have economies grow and move forward. So over time, the cost of goods goes up: food, cars, trips, airline travel, so forth. We benefit from electronics with costs actually going down as people learn out how to build them and make them for less cost. Two prime examples of this. Back in 1986, I purchased my first personal computer. It was a Macintosh 512 enhanced computer. The 512 stood for 512K of RAM. It was half a megabyte of RAM. It was a standalone computer, keyboard, etc., no printer. And I remember to the day what that cost. It was $1,500, $1,500. It is very easy to find inflation calculators with a very quick Google search. With a check for inflation, that Macintosh computer today would cost $4,400. So from $1,500, the equivalent price today in 2023 is $4,400. I don't need to tell any of you how much a computer 10 times that capable costs today. That's an example of how we benefit from costs going down as people learn how to efficiently manufacture electronics. The same thing applies for our RC radios. Back in the mid to late 1970s, early 1980s, Kraft radio systems were the Cadillac of the radio systems. Phil Kraft did tremendous work as an engineer building his company. Kraft radios won all the competitions. They were absolutely rock solid, beautiful radios. In the late 1970s, a Kraft Signature Series RC system, 4 channels, would cost $795. Now back then, before the computerized radios, you would buy everything: a transmitter, flight pack battery, servos, and receiver, because just one set of radios was per aircraft. It was very unusual to have multiple aircraft for one transmitter, $795. To correct for inflation from that, from the late 1970s at $795, that radio would cost $4,400 today, okay? So that's what the cost of a 4-channel radio cost, $4,400. That's why you didn't see a ton of people flying RC model airplanes. The radios are just very expensive. Today on Amazon, you can buy a Spectrum 4-channel transmitter with a 4-channel receiver for $149. So the price is going down for our electronics. That is a good thing. Let's take a look at another example of ultra micro electronics, how things are getting smaller, cheaper, and lighter. And this will be applied to our discussion for remote ID module. In line with the cost that's gone down in the size of RC electronics, take a look at this device. It doesn't even have a name. I call it the Park Zone Brick. And I'll have a link in the description when you get it. This whole thing is a receiver, an electronic speed control, and 2 linear servos. This is a little antenna right here, connects to the battery. So receiver, ESC, 2 servos, this is $60. So with this type of miniaturization and cost reduction, I truly think that the cost of the remote ID modules will be affordable. As a very quick review for remote ID, it was a rule implemented by the FAA in late December of 2020. It goes into stages with manufacturers. There's nothing we have to do as modelers to comply with remote ID till September 16th, 2023. I repeat, nothing we have to do with our flying activities until September 16th, 2023. There are 3 types of remote ID that you will see discussed. There's a standard where the remote ID comes built in with the drones from the factory. There is a remote ID module where you get electronics. You can put that module in your airplane to be remote ID compliant. And finally, there's FRIAs, which is an FAA recognized identification area. These are areas agreed to by certain community-based organizations like the Academy of Model Aeronautics and the FAA, where modelers within the airspace of a FRIA can fly with no remote ID at all. It is exempt airspace for the remote ID requirement. As we head towards the September 16th, 2023 date when we all have to be remote ID compliant, except if you're flying in the FRIAs, the manufacturers have been mandated to be compliant with remote ID by December 16th of 2022. So this is being filmed of June of 2023. There are over 100 manufacturers, models of drones that are being sold right now that are remote ID compliant. Take a look at the DJI Corporation. They have 20 drones listed in this screenshot of their website that are remote ID compliant. So these are all set, they're totally legal at remote ID now. There's no way to turn it off, it's on. And what's important about the drones is the drones are kind of the trigger point, the flash point for the remote ID discussion with the FAA. Because the drones, due to the nature, a lot of these drone pilots, you can buy it, you fly in the airspace without any training. They fly in the controlled airspace, class B, C, D, without a clearance. It generates a lot of interest. What's going to happen, and you'll see this in my remote ID discussion, the drones are going to age out and get replaced with new drones, just assuming the lifespan of a typical drone is about 3 years. Over the next 3 years, all the drones will be replaced by drones that are remote ID compliant. So a lot of the people complaining about remote ID, I'm not going to comply. If you're flying a drone 3 years from now, you're going to be remote ID compliant. It'll happen in the background just as a result of this process with the FAA. Let's take a look now at the CubePilot remote ID module for $39. I'm not being sponsored by this. I have not touched it. This is based on internet research. But CubePilot is a well-known manufacturer of autopilots for drones. They understand where remote ID is going in the drone community, decided to get ahead of the problem by engineering a remote ID module, and here it is. The module is about 1/2 by 1 inch by 1/2 inch in dimensions. It weighs about 10 grams, which is 0.35 ounces, so it's very light. It uses Bluetooth technology. The range is probably going to be the order of 1.5 kilometers. That's less than a mile, about 0.9 miles. And it is optimized for drones and the architecture of drones. It has FCC and CE approvals. That's the Federal Communications Commission, and CE is the European Communication Commissions. The CubePilot remote ID module does not have FAA permission yet. Again, this is just a discussion of what's out there being developed. And as we mentioned with the DJI, the 20 drones, the technology exists there to make remote ID work. the modules is not going to be too much work, as shown by this CubePilot demonstration. I can see other manufacturers developing this get smaller, lighter, just like we saw with the radio control systems. So I think this is a good indication of where the technology and price point is going for drones for the remote ID module. Now, as a reminder, this whole video is geared towards recreational flyers. If you're a recreational flyer, you need one remote ID module for all your models. If you have 20 models in your garage, you can swap out the remote ID module between models, buy multiple ones if you want. Part 107, the commercial, there's different rules on that. Each individual airplane needs a remote ID module, but if you're Part 107, you understand the rules, and I'm not covering that here. So I'd like to take a little bit of an editorial discussion or comment now on remote ID. I get a lot of comments from viewers, which I enjoy to see what people are thinking out there. And there are many modelers that say, I'm simply not going to comply with the remote ID requirement. So that's a personal decision. I will comply with it. I'll be flying in a FRIA almost for sure once they start getting approved here in late summer. I don't mind spending $39 for a remote ID module, so I will be compliant. But what I will say to viewers is, from my research, remote ID is here to stay. And I'm going to give you some reasons why it's here to stay. I think big picture remote ID is going to become a bit of a non-issue as time goes on. The reason I say that, and you'll see here in some FAA documentation where they discuss remote ID is a foundation for the building block of how the FAA is integrating unmanned aircraft into the National Airspace System. The FAA is very comfortable dealing with manned aircraft and the rules and regulations to mix a wide variety of aircraft, airliners, private aircraft, military aircraft. Unmanned aircraft is new to everybody. The aircraft are being invented as we speak. And the key thing from the FAA's viewpoint, there's not a pilot in the cockpit of an unmanned aircraft, and so a very fundamental concept of safety called see and avoid cannot be implemented. So how do you mix drone traffic with everybody else? Remote ID is a step in that direction. So without going into a tremendous amount of detail, as drones started proliferating into the airspace, Congress and the FAA realized something had to be done. The very first step was around 2015 with the FAA mandated registration of your drones. But then a few years later in 2018, it became clear that something had to be done to track the drones flying in the National Airspace System. The idea being that the FAA has to know who is flying in the National Airspace System. This is not a problem with full-scale aircraft. There's registration numbers. You can meet an aircraft when it lands. But a lot of small drones flying around is becoming a problem. So in 2018, the Congress directed the FAA to come up with a remote ID plan to track these drones flying in the National Airspace System. It's not for traffic deconfliction. It's to provide information on where the drone is flying and specifically where it takes off and assume where it's going to land. This is a brand new requirement. The technology didn't exist. Nobody knew about it. The modeling public was not aware of this. It's being rolled out pretty quickly, in my opinion. As I mentioned earlier, September 16th, 2023 is when we have to be compliant with the remote ID. But this is all happening in real time. It is a sea change for modelers where we have to do something like this in the National Airspace System outside of the FRIAs. And a lot of modelers are resistant to this. And I understand that concern because of the change. As a private and commercial pilot myself, I grew up with the FAA regulations. I don't question them too much. For people, drone pilots, RC pilots that have never had to even read an FAA regulation, much less follow it, this is a little bit of a culture shock. But remote ID is coming, and these are some thoughts about how we can deal with it as a community. One thing I hear a lot is that the AMA is a complete waste of time, that they don't do anything to help us. I respectfully disagree with that sentiment completely, and the following background. What happens in Washington with these very large policy decisions like remote ID? It's a surprisingly low-level group of technicians that have discussions, form what to do, to write papers to form that to their bosses. I know from my experience, where I spent 7 years in Washington, I was working at the Pentagon at the time, the way these discussions work of fairly important policy issues is there's discussions and meetings. If you're not part of those meetings and discussions, you are going to lose. This is important because the AMA, as a community-based organization with tens of thousands of modelers, was a very good focal point to advocate for our RC model planes and drones, because the FAA lumps them all as small unmanned air vehicles. The FAA had credibility due to the number of modelers, they had a depth of knowledge, and they could literally educate the FAA on what was going on with model aviation with this proposed remote ID ruling. The AMA did two things. They were part of stakeholders with other modeling organizations, primarily the EAA, the Experimental Aircraft Association, which is a huge nationwide organization for home-built aircraft and World War II fighters, military fighters, as well as the AOPA, which is an extremely important, influential organization, the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association. AOPA is very involved with rules, regulations, medical issues. They all sat down, discussed this with the FAA, and there were significant changes in the rules as a result of that. In addition, the AMA formed a coalition of hobby companies that could show the FAA, we're not just alone saying this, there's a bunch of industries that have an interest in this. We need to come to a reasonable understanding of remote ID so that we don't do something that is incredibly bad, which is what happened when the FAA came out with their initial rule on remote ID. So let's go through that for a second. So the FAA wrote their initial rule, and you'll see it here in the video. I've got a copy here. I'll glance down and make sure I get it right. This is in the 2019 time period, and the way it works is the FAA will write a proposed rule, in this case the remote ID, send it out for 60 days worth of comments. The FAA got approximately 53,000 comments on that, to include me. They read these comments, discussed them with the AMA, the other organizations, the other stakeholders, to try to figure out what to do. And just let me show you how much was changed due to the involvement of the AMA. And I don't work for the AMA, I don't talk to the AMA, I don't get any money from them. I'm just an RC model that wants to see the best outcome. So the first thing from the FAA before it was changed was to fly your RC model aircraft or drone, you had to connect to the internet. You had to establish a connection to the internet to track that entire flight. Think about that for a second. So it became clear that A, we don't want to have a national database with all these tracked drones, and there's many areas where people fly drones, American citizens in North Dakota, Montana, I don't live there, that it's hard to get an internet connection. So the final rule was remote ID is broadcast only, there's no internet required. That's a win. The next thing the FAA was proposing, that we would have to pay a monthly subscription to some UAS service supplier to fly our RC model aircraft. This could have easily been $10 a month just for the permission to log on to their network. That requirement was removed along with the removal of the internet requirement. That was the original proposal. FRIAs, the FAA recognized identification area, was going to be good for 1 year only. AMA discussed FRIAs are going to be available forever. They're good for 4 years, they can be renewed, and the latest from the AMA, just last month, the AMA is exploring the FAA the possibility of letting the AMA authorize FRIAs and just backbriefing the FAA without having to go through them. They wanted a per aircraft registration for recreational flyers. They changed that to it's just an individual registration, all your aircraft covered by that individual, recreation only. The special events are not addressed, like contests and things like that. That is now addressed. The original range to fly your RC models was 400 feet away from where you're flying. That was crazy. And the AMA educated the FAA. It's now a 400-foot altitude AGL within visual sight. And then a few other things, but you get a gist of how the involvement of the AMA with other organizations led to a much more palatable remote ID ruling. So in conclusion, I'd like to talk about my earlier statement where it says remote ID is here to stay. So I have here, and I'll show you on the screen, the Department of Transportation written by the FAA. This is the final rule. I repeat, the final rule, and the title of it is Remote Identification of Unmanned Aircraft. This is it. These are the first few pages. This final ruling is 470 pages. 470 pages. That's how much work has gone into remote ID. So anybody that thinks remote ID is just a passing thing, 470 pages. So just let me read a little bit of it. This was signed out by the administrator of the FAA, Steve Dixon. This was in February, I believe, of 2022. This is required by the Act of Congress authorizing the FAA because they have to report what they're doing on remote ID. So it's by the FAA to their bosses, Department of Transportation. The action is the final rule. And just let me read you the summary. This is one sentence summary of the remote ID ruling. This action, the remote ID, requires the remote identification of unmanned aircraft. Just think about that, the remote identification of unmanned aircraft. The remote identification of unmanned aircraft in the airspace of the United States will address safety, national security, and law enforcement concerns regarding the further integration of these aircraft into the airspace of the United States, laying a foundation for greater operational capabilities. So it's not air traffic control. They can't see you on the radar scopes. It is for safety. In other words, a drone flying over somebody crashes on them. Hopefully they don't get hurt. National security, which I'm going to touch upon in a moment, and then law enforcement. Law enforcement wants to know who is flying the drone in case they wish to question that owner. They might have flown in restricted airspace over a public event. There might be a temporary flight restriction. They need to know who was flying that drone. A lot of people are upset about that. They're concerned about the Karens, for lack of a better term, attacking them from their takeoff location. I don't have a good answer on that, but it's all supposition at this point. We don't know until we fly a little bit. My belief is with the sheer numbers of drones flying out there, the range is 9/10 of a mile. I don't think it's a problem people are making it out to be, but we'll see. I don't know. The other editorial comment I want to make, and I'm not going to dwell on this, is national security. Since when has anybody heard of RC model airplanes and national security being involved? The reason for this is anybody who has been watching the news lately in, say, Ukraine, the drones we fly for hobbies are used in combat. They are used for reconnaissance with their pictures and in many cases to drop lightweight bombs or hand grenades in combat operations. The federal government is absolutely aware of this and is concerned if this should happen within the United States. God forbid, I'm going to stop there. But for these types of potential activities, they've got to have some idea who is flying where and when to question this person in the event something like that happens. And I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you for taking the time to view this video. I appreciate having a chance to talk to you. Remote ID is here to stay, I truly believe. I think we'll be able to adapt to it. It's more and more going to become built in. Now, I'll make a prediction. I have zero evidence on this, but I believe remote ID is going to be so important. We're going to start seeing remote ID built into our normal receivers that we fly for RC model aircraft. So between the drones having them built in, RC equipment being sold with remote ID built in, gradually as old equipment gets replaced by new equipment, remote ID will just become part of the background, things that go on necessary as the UAV, drone traffic expands and grows as an industry in the United States.